Hello everyone. Before we start, I want to take a moment to warn you about the third story. Its details are gruesome, so viewer discretion is advised. James M. Hines was born in East Hebron, New York, to Charles and Jane Hines. He was the youngest of 6 children, with his brother Henry also becoming an attorney. His other siblings were William, John, Calvin, and a sister named Jane. Hines attended high school at the Washington Academy in Salem, New York, and pursued higher education at Albany Normal School. He studied law at a school in St. Louis, Missouri, and graduated from Cincinnati Law School 4 years after his brother Henry. Hines left home at age 19 and headed west. After earning his law degree, he moved to the Minnesota Territory in 1856 at the age of 23, settling in St. Peter, the county seat of Nicollet County, which was 40 miles west of his brother Henry in Shakopee, Minnesota. There, Hines opened a law practice and was elected district attorney for the county. During this time, St. Peter was experiencing significant turmoil due to conflicts between settlers, homesteaders, and the Dakota Sioux, culminating in the Dakota War of 1862. Hines enlisted as a private in the 1st Minnesota Cavalry's Mounted Rangers, Company E, during the conflict. He had hoped St. Peter would become the capital of the new state of Minnesota, but by early 1865 he realized the town would remain a small farming village. Seeking new opportunities, he relocated with his wife and 2 young daughters to Little Rock, Arkansas, in mid-1865 during the Reconstruction era. Hines found Arkansas, one of the 11 former Confederate states, heavily degraded by the Civil War. The economy and labor system, which had relied on slavery, were in ruins, and fighting between Confederate and Union forces had caused population decline and the loss of millions of dollars in property. Like many Northerners, Hines did not grasp the depth of the South's resentment towards African Americans and Northerners. He believed that following the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, the Civil War, and the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, freedmen in the South should enjoy the same liberties as in the North. However, he underestimated the fierce resistance from whites who had sided with the Confederacy. Logan H. Roots, a contemporary who represented Arkansas in Congress, later eulogized these sentiments. Hines was labeled a carpetbagger, a derogatory term used by resentful Southerners to disparage Northerners who moved south during the Reconstruction. In mid-1865, Hines established a law practice in Little Rock with Elisha Baxter, one of the state's leading Unionists. Baxter, who had fought with the Union Army during the war, was later appointed to the Arkansas Supreme Court by the newly established government and eventually became governor of Arkansas. In October of 1867, Hines was elected as a delegate to Arkansas's 1868 Constitutional Convention, where he served as a chairman of the Committee on the Elective Franchise. The new Constitution, ratified in March of 1868, provided voting rights for black males over the age of 21 and established public schools for both black and white children. Elected to Congress for the 2nd Congressional District as a Republican early that year, Hines went to Washington, D.C. in April of 1868, where he facilitated Arkansas's re-entry into the Union under the 1867 Reconstruction Acts. In May of 1868, he was a delegate at the Republican National Convention in Chicago. Returning to Arkansas in August, Hines campaigned vigorously for Republican presidential candidate Ulysses S. Grant and for civil rights for former slaves. Hines was the first U.S. congressman to be assassinated while in office. He was murdered on the eve of the 1868 presidential election, a contest focused on civil rights and suffrage for freed slaves. The Republican Party, led by former Union Army General Ulysses S. Grant, supported these measures, while the Democratic Party opposed them. On October 22, 1868, as Hines was headed to a campaign event for Grant near Indian Bay in Monroe County, he and fellow Republican politician Joseph Brooks were shot in the back with a shotgun by a man. Brooks managed to stay on his horse and ride to the event to seek help. Hines was knocked off his horse by the blast and lay on the road until assistance arrived. Before he died, Hines wrote a brief message to his wife and identified his attacker. He succumbed to his injuries about 2 hours after the attack. The coroner's inquest identified the shooter as George Clark, secretary of the Monroe County Democratic Party and a local Klansman, but Clark was never arrested or prosecuted. Arkansas Governor Powell Clayton, alarmed by the murder and the increasing violence against Republicans and former slaves, feared it might signal a broader attack on the state officials to seize control of the government and polls before the election. He initiated military action against the Ku Klux Klan, but the anticipated insurrection did not materialize. Hines is buried near his birthplace at Evergreen Cemetery in Salem, New York, and there is a memorial stone in his honor at the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Tom Dula was born into a poor Appalachian Hill country family in Wilkes County, North Carolina, likely as the youngest of 3 brothers with one sister, Eliza. Dula grew up, attended school, and played with Ann Foster and her cousins, Laura and Pauline. On March 15, 1862, 3 months before his 18th birthday, Tom enlisted as a private in the Confederate Army with Company K, 42nd North Carolina Infantry Regiment. He was captured but released in April of 1865. Dula wrote a 15-page account of his life, along with a note exonerating Ann Foster, who was then using the married name Melton. His literacy was remarkable, given the harsh poverty of his upbringing. Known for his fiddle playing, Dula was considered a ladies' man by those who knew him well. Dula did not emerge from the war unscathed, as some folklore, oral tradition, and modern writers suggest. He was wounded several times in battle. His brothers died in the war, leaving Tom as his mother's sole remaining boy. Ann Foster married an older man, James Melton, who was a farmer, cobbler, and neighbor of both the Fosters and Dulas. Melton served in the Civil War, participating in the Battle of Gettysburg. Both Melton and Dula were captured and sent to a northern prison camp. After their release and return home, Dula resumed his relationship with Ann. Known for his libertine reputation, Dula soon became involved with Laura Foster, Ann's cousin. According to folklore, Laura became pregnant and she and Dula planned to elope. On the morning of May 25, 1866, when she was to meet Dula, Laura quietly left her home on her father's horse and was never seen alive again. Details of what happened that day remain unclear, but many stories implicate Ann Melton. Some tales claim Ann murdered Laura Foster out of jealousy, suspecting that Dula was going to marry her. These stories suggest Dula knew Ann had killed Laura but took the blame out of love. Ann's information led to the discovery of Laura's body, further fueling suspicion of her guilt. Ann's cousin, Pauline Foster, testified that Ann had shown her the grave one night to ensure it was still hidden. During the trial, witnesses testified that Dula had made an incriminating statement about intending to do in the person who gave him the pock. They suggested Dula believed Laura had given him syphilis, which he had then passed to Ann. However, a local doctor testified that he had treated Dula, Ann, and Pauline Foster for syphilis, indicating Pauline was likely the original source of the infection. Laura Foster's decomposed body was eventually found in a shallow grave with her legs drawn up to fit. She had been stabbed once in the chest. The gruesome murder and the love triangle, coupled with the circulating rumors, captured public attention and led to the lasting notoriety of the crime. Dula's role in the murder remains debated. After Laura's body was found, Dula fled the area and was accused of the crime. He stayed briefly with his relative, Thomas Dula, whose home later became Dula Springs Hotel. Calling himself Tom Hall, he worked for about a week for Colonel James Grayson in Trade, Tennessee. Grayson was later mentioned in a song about Dula, creating the myth that he was Dula's rival for Laura Foster's love. In reality, Grayson had no prior connection to either Dula or Foster. Once Dula's identity was discovered, Grayson helped the Wilkes County posse capture him, but that was his only involvement in the affair. Following Tom Dula's arrest, former North Carolina Governor Zebulon Vance represented him pro bono and maintained Dula's innocence until his death. Vance succeeded in having the trial moved from Wilkesboro to Statesville, believing Dula could not receive a fair trial in Wilkes County. Despite this, Dula was convicted. Although he was granted a new trial on appeal, he was convicted again. His supposed accomplice, Jack Keaton, was set free, and based on Dula's testimony, Ann Melton was acquitted. As he stood on the gallows, Dula reportedly declared, "Gentlemen, I did not harm a single hair on that fair lady's head." He was executed on May 1, 1868, nearly 2 years after Laura Foster's murder. Dula's younger sister and her husband retrieved his body for burial. According to Albert Hicks's testimony, he was born around 1820 in Foster, Rhode Island. His father, a farmer, had 7 sons, with Hicks being the second youngest. Known for his headstrong and combative nature, Hicks never attended school and worked on the family farm until he ran away at age 15 to Norwich, Connecticut. There, he embarked on a life of crime, leading to his arrest for theft and subsequent imprisonment. Hicks frequently escaped from jail, but was repeatedly caught and given harsher sentences, including a year in solitary confinement, which he claimed drove him somewhat insane. He vowed revenge against the whole human race. For the next 20 years, Hicks's life was marked by murder and mayhem across the high seas, California goldfields, South America, Mexico, the South Pacific, and the Atlantic Trade Triangle. His main activities were ship mutinies and highway robberies, and it is believed that he may have killed hundreds of people. He and his accomplices typically murdered their victims, then spent their ill-gotten gains on alcohol, prostitutes, and fine clothing until the money ran out. Despite his notorious reputation, Hicks was known as a storyteller, and when his confessions were published, the New York Times expressed skepticism about their accuracy. However, modern biographer Rich Cohen found evidence supporting at least some of Hicks's tales. By age 40, Hicks had settled in New York City with his new wife, who was unaware of his criminal past, and young child. Desperate to support his family, he reverted to the only skills he knew: crime. Hicks hired on as a deckhand with the oyster sloop A.E. Johnson out of New York City, knowing it carried a large amount of cash for purchasing oysters in Virginia to be transported back to New York. The boat's crew consisted of Captain George H. Burr, brothers Oliver and Smith Watts, and Hicks. As the boat neared the Narrows at night, Captain Burr and Oliver went to sleep. Smith had night duty, and Hicks joined him on deck, offering to take turns at the wheel. Hicks pointed out something to Smith, who saw nothing. When Smith turned his back, Hicks grabbed a sea axe and struck him in the back of the head, knocking him to the deck. Hearing the noise, Oliver Watts emerged from the cabin hatchway, and Hicks decapitated him with the axe. The body slowly slumped, and the head rolled onto the blood-sprayed deck. Hicks then entered Captain Burr's cabin with the bloodied axe. The captain, now alert, was a tall and strong man, and the ensuing struggle was fierce. Burr nearly strangled Hicks, but Hicks eventually slashed the captain with the axe, slicing off half of his face, including an eyeball and nose, which remained hanging on the axe blade. Exhausted from the fight, Hicks searched the cabin for loot. Returning to the deck, Hicks was startled to see Smith, still alive, moving towards him. Thinking he saw a ghost, Hicks forced the injured man overboard. Smith grasped the rail and hung on, but Hicks swung the axe, chopping off his fingers, which fell onto the deck as the rest of Smith slipped into the water. Hicks then threw the other bodies and the axe overboard. The A.E. Johnson, now unattended, collided with another ship, the schooner J.R. Mather, breaking the Johnson's main mast and bringing down her rigging. Hicks attempted to sink the ship to hide the evidence of the killings by drilling holes through the keel. He took the money, about $230, along with the possessions of the murdered crew, and abandoned the ship in a yawl, rowing to shore. He landed around daybreak next to a farmer's field on Staten Island, just above Fort Richmond. Believing he had escaped capture, Hicks returned to Manhattan, stopping at saloons, drinking merrily, and making a spectacle of himself. The abandoned but still afloat A.E. Johnson was discovered by the Coast Guard the following day, its deck and cabin covered in blood, including a set of severed fingers. The city's shock and intrigue over the gruesome scene grew as the mystery unfolded. Police detectives noted the missing yawl and began a search for it. After a few days, a local boy led them to its location, abandoned among some rushes. They then tracked a series of witness reports describing a man carrying a large, heavy sea bag, which eventually led them to an apartment in Manhattan. Hicks, having read about the police pursuit in newspapers, fled the city. By this time, detectives had identified him and continued to trace his movements through witnesses who remembered a large man traveling with a wife and small child by train and boat heading north. The trail led them to a boarding home outside Providence, Rhode Island. There, they surrounded the house in the middle of the night and arrested Hicks in bed without resistance. In his possession, they found Captain Burr's watch, several money bags, and a daguerreotype belonging to Watts, along with other incriminating evidence. Hicks's trial became a media sensation, with overwhelming physical evidence against him and little effective rebuttal from the defense. The jury deliberated for only about 7 minutes before delivering a guilty verdict. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging. Following the verdict, Hicks provided a full confession of the murders and his life story, which was published as a book on the day of his execution. Hicks attributed his actions to being possessed by the devil. He was executed by hanging on Friday, July 13, 1860, on Bedloe's Island, now known as Liberty Island, where the Statue of Liberty stands. Approximately 10,000 people witnessed the event from boats anchored in New York Bay. Hicks was dressed in a striking electric blue suit made for the occasion. Hicks did not make a final speech, simply instructing the executioner to hang me quick, make haste. Soon after his burial, grave robbers stole his body, which was possibly sold to medical students at Columbia University. Due to the disappearance of his body, unfounded rumors persisted for years that he had survived and escaped.